All right, next up, we've got Avi Gross. And our other partner, Chuck from Thule, is sick, so he will not be making it. So it's Avi solo. But ET, we're going to dive deep into ET. As you guys know, this was released last year. Still very new to the majority of the CropX dealers out here. And some of the reasons were we were a little bit unsure on how we fully utilize this new ET sensor. Now, after most of you guys have been running soil sensors, since the beginning of your start with CropX, I think a lot of us were challenged with understanding the value of ET and where it fits if we're already using soil sensors. Essentially, they're both trying to do the same thing. They're both trying to help us with irrigation scheduling. But where do we use one versus where do we use the other? Or where is the value when we use the combination of both? And so today we're going to dive in, do a deep dive with one of our lead data scientists, Avi Gross here. And he's really going to show us the better understanding of the underlying data with ET and how it works. So, Avi? And the only other thing I'll mention is we can try to keep this interactive, Avi, just like the last session. So if you guys have questions along the way, please raise your hand and we can discuss that while he's working through it.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, please feel free to interrupt. You don't even have to raise your hand, just start speaking. It's good with me. So I think since Chuck is not here, we're gonna end a little bit earlier. And we're gonna start out by going through just talking about ET. What is ET? The fundamentals of it. And sort of the science behind the ET calculation. So what goes into calculating ET? And then understanding why what ET's value is and why it's not just a number. It's just not just a way to say, oh, I've used such and such inches, and to sort of understand more about what's going on in my crop, and then understanding stress and how stress factors into this. So let's begin. So what is ET? What is evapotranspiration, right? It's a combination of two words, evaporation and transpiration. And we can see here, right? You see this tree right here, right? And that's like obviously the thing that we're looking at is evapotranspiration, and it's a combination of these two processes. One of them is a physical thing, okay? That's something that just happens regardless of anything. Doesn't matter if there's plants there or not. If there's open water on the field, then it'll evaporate. If there's water on the leaf surface, it'll evaporate. It doesn't matter if there's a crop there or not. Transpiration, on the other hand, is a biological process. That's something that happens when there's crops. And specifically, it happens through these things called stomata. And some of you may know these. These are these micropores underneath the leaf's surface. And what happens is that for every, so-and-so amount of water molecules that get transpired through the stomata leaf, it gets a little bit of CO2. And that CO2 gets transformed into sugar. And in the end of the day, that's our yield. And so ET is directly related to your yield, specifically transpiration. So the challenge is, though, is that it's very hard to measure just transpiration, which is what we're interested in, right? But we can measure both of them together. But the question is, how do we measure ET? So there's two very, very prominent methods for measuring ET. And you guys are mostly familiar, I'm sure, with the water balance, where you use soil moisture sensors or rain gauges to sort of understand what the water balance is. And when I say balance, I want you guys to think of like what goes in has to come out. Okay? And but there's another approach to understanding how much ET there is, right? And that's what we call the energy balance method. That's where we use things like thermocouples and satellite imagery to sort of understand the same sort of concept of it, instead of it being a water balance, what goes in, what goes out. What goes in, what goes out. We're looking actually in terms of energy. So it's an indirect method. But at the end of the day, it actually has its own value proposition because it's so easy. It's much easier to measure these sort of things using these sort of methods. So I want you guys just to think about it the whole time. It's like a balance. It's a budget. Whatever goes in has to come out, right? So let's go through it a little bit more. I'm sure you guys are familiar with, all right, I'm having trouble with this mic. I'm sure you guys are familiar with reference ET or ET naught, as some of you guys call it. And that's, that's a standard. People use that all the time. It's sort of the ET that you hear on the radio or for people talking about ET. This is actually specifically, this equation is something called the Penman-Monteith equation. And this is like an empirical relationship that was found 50 or 60 years ago. And it's not a pretty equation, if you guys can see. And there's lots of things that go into it. Like you have temperature and the amount of wind speed and the vapor pressure deficit. It's pretty nasty. But this is what people do. This is what people use a lot of the times. And it's okay because it's sort of like the baseline. But there's other better ways of understanding how much evapotranspiration there actually is. So what people have done in the past is they take their ET naught or their reference ET, and then they apply a specific crop coefficient, right, for their field. So if you're growing corn or something like that, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. You have this graph right here where you take, in the beginning of the season, you have your reference ET, which I want to remind you all that it's assuming optimal agronomic conditions. So well-watered patch of grass. That's what a reference ET is for. And then you apply a crop coefficient and you turn it into something called ETC or crop evapotranspiration. And you can see here that in the beginning of the season, when the canopy is pretty small, your KC, your crop coefficient, is pretty low. And then as the time goes on, your canopy grows and eventually it goes above 1, depending on your crop. And then you let it dry out, and then when you harvest and things like that, and then it goes down. This is the typical thing. The only problem is that you could have the best reference ET in the world, but if you have a bad KC or a bad crop coefficient, it doesn't mean anything. You're still going to give suboptimal irrigations. So understanding that you could have the best model for your reference ET, but at the end of the day, if you don't have a good KC, then you're really sort of lost. And so that's sort of where actual ET comes in. So like I said before, it's a balance, right? Whatever goes in has to come out. So before people are used to doing this with water balance, but with the energy balance, what we're looking at here is you have sunlight, or what we call net radiation. That's represented by this yellow arrow over here. It's the energy that's coming from the sun into the ground, into the soil, right? And then as it hits the surface of the ground, some of that energy goes into the ground, and we call that G. That's called the ground heat flux. On the other hand, some of that energy goes into heating the atmosphere, okay? That's what we call sensible heat flux, because you can feel it, right? The air is actually getting warmer. But a lot of energy will also go into what we call and that's that H over here. A lot of that energy actually will go into what we call the latent heat flux, which is actually the energy that goes into turning liquid water into vapor, or AKA ET. So if we know each of these components, we can sort of figure out one or the other. If we know some of these, then we can rearrange our equation, right, from algebra, and then understand what we're trying to find out is this, the latent heat flux. No, I'm so sorry. My bad, my bad. I was out of frame of the camera. Let me do that. Is it good now? Okay. Okay, I'm gonna go to this side now. So, as I was saying, if we know some of these components, then we could solve for the other bits. And then the whole point is we want to close this budget. We want to make sure that it goes to 0. So to simplify things though, what we know is that the amount of energy that goes into the ground is relatively small, actually. It's a small portion of the actual energy budget, so around 5 or 10% at the most. And moreover, if we look at on a daily basis between day and night, it actually goes out to 0 because soil heats up during the day, and then at night it's the warmest and it starts to release that heat. So we can sort of simplify our equation and then because we're interested in looking at our latent heat flux, which is the ET, what we do is we take how much energy is going in, so the net radiation, and then we subtract the sensible heat, so the amount of energy that's going into the heating the air. And what's left over will be our ET. And the question is, how do we find these things? So net radiation, like I said, is energy from sunlight. It doesn't really change that much from day to day, actually. Well, what does change every day is cloud cover. That's what's really changing, or that's the thing that's the big factor of how much energy is actually coming into the field at any given time. Okay? And we use satellite imagery to figure out how much cloud cover you have on your field. And when I'm talking about satellite imagery, I think a lot of people are, familiar with more of like those other things like, Landsat and Sentinel and things like that. That's not what I'm talking about at all. Like I'm using a satellite. What we're using is we're using geostation satellites. Okay, the ones I just mentioned before, Sentinel and Landsat, those are called LEO or low Earth orbit satellites. Okay, those are polar orbiting. They go around the Earth. You get like an image every 4, 5 days if you're lucky, and that's if you're because there's no clouds or anything, or the image itself isn't scrambled. But we're using these geostationary satellites. So it has a fixed position. It doesn't rotate around the Earth. It orbits with the Earth. So it's more of like a weather satellite. So we understand actually what our cloud cover is, and then we know what our net radiation is. Then the last piece of the puzzle is understanding our sensible heat flux, which is how we do it with a thermocouple right here. And so it's really at the end of the day, it comes down to algebra. Getting these things can be a little tough sometimes, but given that we figured that out, then we can figure out how much ET we have. Is there any questions until now? Great. Okay. So before I showed you a figure of, your reference ET multiplied by your, canopy size or your crop coefficient, KC, and that would give you your ETC or your crop evapotranspiration. But, I'm going to say a bad word right now. Sometimes there's stress in your field, and you want to know. It's important for some people too. Sometimes people want to induce stress even. And so that's what we call actual water use or ETA. Because that's really at the end of the day, this is what's going on in your field. Because when you have a bad KC and you're ignoring your stress, you're not irrigating according to what you should be. You're not irrigating according to what's actually happening in the field. Bless you. So what I want to say now is that if you take your actual ET and you divide it by reference evapotranspiration or reference ET, and we can get something like a KC ourselves too. But it's better than a KC because it's not based off of a model. It's an actual measurement in reference to another measurement. And so I'm going to show you this graph right here. This is an alfalfa field. I forgot where, but we had an ET sensor installed there. And you could see this blue line right here, okay? That's your crop coefficient over time. Okay, does anyone understand what's going on here with it? And so the green line over here is actually your crop coefficient based off of remote sensing, typical method that they use. And so does anyone know why you see these drops, right, in your crop coefficient? Harvest, right, cuttings. And so what I want to show you, there's two things I want to show you with this graph. The first being, right, it's not so easy to see, but with remote sensing, let's say, or satellite imagery, you have really, really bad temporal coverage. Like I said, you are getting an image every 5 days. And if you're going to try to make irrigation decisions based on that and extrapolate out, and goodness knows if you miss a day because of whatever reason, then you're going to go a couple of weeks without any idea of what's actually going on. You're making assumptions. And so, but the reference, with the ET sensor, you're getting a canopy measurement every single day. You're seeing what's actually going on in your field. Every single day, you're getting a measurement. And on top of that, the second thing I want to talk about is that I think you guys can see it. Like, okay, the cuttings, we can see that they're pretty correlated together. But what's happening here is that the recovery period, this alfalfa recovers really fast, right? And so if you were to irrigate according to the crop coefficient that we have here from satellite imagery, but in actuality, in your field, you see that it's different. You're getting, it's like a lag oftentimes because the image, there's probably no image in this time period. And so it just sort of interpolated in between. But in truth, you should be irrigating way more, something like 20% more. And so you'd be under irrigating for your recovery period for your alfalfa. So that's something that's like people should know. People want to know. If we go back to that figure I just showed you before, so before we were just talking about the canopy size, but I don't like to think about it in terms of canopy size. I like to think about more of it like canopy robustness, because you don't doesn't have to be a big canopy for it to really, really pump. So the other part of it is though is water stress, so crop stress, and there's an image of grapes here, and this is something that like growers intentionally actually do. And actually, at the end of the season, even corn growers are going to try to stress out your crop to dry it out, right? And so this is something that's also offered that we give. And this is so, you'll get a daily value of crop stress as well. And this is the actual, this is actually what's going on in your field. And so the value in this though is not only that, you're seeing how much stress there is, but it's that before, if you were just to use the ET data, you don't know, maybe how much to irrigate, but you don't know when to irrigate. That's a big issue. And so if you don't know when to irrigate, it's also pretty useless if you're trying to intentionally cause stress. But when you have, when you know what your stress coefficient is and you know what bounds it should be through, because it's your crop, it's typically it's specific to each crop. So if you know that, then you know actually when you should be irrigating and how much stress you can cause safely without damaging your crop. Any questions? Okay. So, this is the part where Chuck would come up and start talking. Unfortunately, he's not feeling well whatsoever. But I think we'll just go through his stuff and then we'll see, and then I could take some more again too. So with his, yeah, so like as I said, ET is like a combined process of is a combination of two physical processes, right? And ET is not just influenced by lack of moisture, right? It could happen because of disease, pest. It could happen for a load of reasons, any sort of stressors. And it's important that we know how well our plants are keeping up with atmospheric demand and how robust they are and how strong they are. Because at the end of the day, like, like I said before, ET is like directly correlated, not even correlated. It's the relationship between ET. ET is your yield. The more ET you have, the more yield you will have. So, and so these are some of the other slides. Let me just go through this. And so, like for instance, like I said before, it's directly related to your yield. You want to cause stress and when to irrigate. And so this is like I was saying before, it's not just important for vines or things like that. It's also, for watermelons. I think, the more you stress them out, the sweeter they get, but you don't want to do it too much. Um, Peppers, if you like your pepper spicy, you should stress them. They'll get spicier. So these are sort of the things these are strategies. So it's not just about, making sure your crop is well watered. It's about improving the quality of the crop itself. And that's something that I think that we don't talk about as much, actually. Um, Here's some comparisons between ET and, other sort of things. An advantage of the ET sensor actually is that it's not a point measurement. It's actually, it has a large fetch. So it's an integration of other signals together, of lots of parts of your field together. And so it gives you sort of like a more, you have a wider, yeah, you have a better idea of what's actually going on within your field as opposed to just making sure that like, I hope that wherever my sensors are installed, that they're in a good spot. Um, and there's this whole thing about, sustainability, right? Like, and we don't want to over irrigate or under irrigate, because of yield and quality issues, but also we want to just make sure that we irrigate specifically to how much we need to. Um, Yeah, and so there was a case, not a case study necessarily, but there was a customer, this grower, Foley Family's Vineyard, and they've been, avid users of the product ever since 2015, and they making sure that they actually, they were able to save a bunch of money actually across a bunch of their entire farm by incorporating all of these, tactics that I just mentioned before. So, thank you. Yeah. For what? For ET? So you would want to be around 300 feet downwind of the prevailing wind of your field. But the way I like to think of it, I just want as much canopy around me as possible. That's really what it is. So I would say like 200, 300 feet of canopy around you is ideal. If you start to put, we're doing experiments right now of exactly where to place it and even how high to place it, right? Because, at the end of the day, what we're trying to see is we're trying to see the atmospheric mixing of vapors and of these eddies, as they call them. And so I would think that like you would want to make sure that it's in a place. It's not typically good to have it on the edge of the field necessarily next to the road because you're going to get the signal from the road. And also, on the other side of the road, there could be another grower's field, and that could be influencing it too. So that's something to bear in mind, So, pardon? Absolutely. That's like, I think, the best place, actually. No, because the thing is that at the end of the day, what we're trying to see is we're trying to see atmospheric mixing. And so if there's a concrete pad there, you would think that maybe that you would actually over-report your, evapotranspiration. But if you keep it sufficiently high, you want to keep it above the canopy as high, then it will be fine. Yeah, I had that suspicion too. Exactly. And it actually worked out great.
Hey, Avi, a couple of things. If you could just repeat the questions or comments.
Oh, yeah,
So
sorry,
that
my
everybody
bad.
can hear
I'm
'em.
not-
What was the last
Yeah,
question?
what's your name? Brian was asking about what's sort of like the ideal placement for the sensor. So, and the idea is to just have as much canopy around you as possible.
Yeah. So the answer was, with our product, we recommend 300 feet from the edge of the managed crop zone, whatever that is, usually the field. And then the follow-up question was pivot point.
Oh, yeah.
Great. We actually sell like a mounting kit that comes with the system that's specifically for that.
Yeah.
Avi, I wanted to ask a question or start a conversation on tying something that you pointed out with your graphs, like from like the alfalfa case, and something that Nick Stahl and Rebecca were talking about this morning. They showed a graph of an idealized ET curve across a whole season from a corn plant.
Mhm.
And it's like that beautiful, smooth line that a lot of us have seen in our
Yeah.
agronomy textbooks or hydrology textbooks back in the day.
Yeah.
It might be good to touch on why these look more jagged and different than that
Sure.
norm or expectation.
Sure. Absolutely. So, there's a lot of things that come into play, like as I mentioned before, right, about why, necessarily those idealized smooth curves, they're not necessarily, why that's not necessarily reflecting reality. There's, you could have necessarily, it could be cases, let's say, where maybe there's not enough soil moisture and that could be actually affecting your crop. And that's something that's like, there's stressors in your field that we don't necessarily always know about. Also, sometimes what will happen is that, if you irrigate a bunch, right? If you over irrigate, or if there's a really big rainstorm, you'll have really high ET and you'll say, this doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? These values are way too high. And you're like, my response is that, well, you're right. They are really high, way too high. But the idea is that that's because there's so much more evaporation now than there was before. And that's actually touches on something about efficiency and irrigation efficiency, right? When you irrigate a bunch and you maybe over irrigate, you don't give enough time for that water to percolate and infiltrate your soil, and it's going to sit on the surface and it's going to evaporate and you're going to lose that water. So then at the same time, that, I think that's like, yeah, I think so. I think that's sort of the idea. And yeah, there's a lot of reasons it could happen though. I'm looking at this graph because it's interesting. It's one of my favorites. Um, yeah. Okay. So what's your name? Chris. Chris asked about, so what do we do with this, right? And so there's a couple of things you can do with this. For one, you want to know sort of idea of how much, well, how's your canopy doing, right? And so we would go into, I would respond by saying, depending on your crop, you could look at your stress factor, and then you would decide whether or not you need to irrigate more or need to irrigate less, maybe. Another thing that you can do with this sort of information is that maybe not necessarily this information, but at the end of the day, this is not the only thing you're getting. You're going to get ET values too every day. And so you would use that for, let's say, making a recommendation, because you know exactly how much is leaving your field now. So you would get an even better recommendation. So and also, if you suddenly see that your KC is, slowly going down when it shouldn't be, then it's indicative that you have an issue in your field. So there's a lot, I think that like it really depends on each field, but at the same time, it's about modifying and like tuning, your irrigation parameters and things like that. So
We have a question here via the Hoover chat. Would it be beneficial to be moving the sensor up as the canopy grows? For in this example, start it lower during the early stage and then increase the height of the sensor as the corn grows.
So, no, it doesn't matter. I've looked into this a lot, and I've been doing experiments about what's the ideal height, and the consensus is that as long as it is sufficiently above the canopy, it'll sense all of the turbulent mixing the entire time, and so you won't be able. And actually, I would advise against moving it all the time, because then you will start actually playing around with the signal too much. So I would advise it. Make sure that, if you're growing corn, make sure it's going to be above the corn crop always, and you'll see that it'll be fine. It'll work. So. What's your name? Mark. If you guys could just say your name before the questions, so I don't have to do. No, Mark. No, it doesn't matter. So Mark asked about does the orientation matter? No, it doesn't really matter. I think, yeah, I wouldn't worry about that. It's okay. It's sort of just like per preference. If you really need it to be high, then you should probably just put it up. But it's easier just to sort of fix it on the side too.
Hey, Avi, a couple things to add if I could.
Yeah.
One is just another advertisement like I did earlier for another session. Tomorrow in the main part of the conference on the main stage, we have another slot of time about ET, which is going to be a little bit more on the commercial side and like some of our thoughts and suggestions about how y'all might want to use it in certain circumstances with your clientele, what sorts of fields, what sorts of questions and conditions. So we were going to go a little bit more into the data and the scientific like we're doing with Avi now, but for those of you that have questions about like, well, where do I use this in my offerings or my portfolio? Much more discussion time on that tomorrow. The other thing I was going to just pass the mic over to Emmanuel here because like Avi mentioned from Chuck's slides in California, the Thule company invented this as a spin out at UC Davis. I think it was 12 years ago now. And the first 10 years of the use of this technology was on the West Coast for high value crops and orchards and vineyards and all that kind of stuff. When we acquired Thule, the first thing that we did was to go test it in corn and soy in the Midwest. And of course, where did we start that whole journey is on Nick Emanuel's farm. So Nick was the first to experience this worldwide on a row crop. So I was going to just ask Nick to sort of voice over his experience of getting that going and what he learned.
Well, the main thing I was going to hit on it and goes to the last couple of questions on placement. Where do we put that ET sensor? How it's oriented, whether that sensor's facing vertical or horizontal? And do we have to move the height of the sensor throughout the growing canopy? And so what we did was we placed that sensor at multiple positions along the center pivot and at multiple heights. So that way we can measure not only the difference in crop canopy, but the difference along the pivot. Again, we had some of the same concerns if we put it at the pivot point. Is that cement pad going to create any conflict or issue? And what we found was keeping it at a consistent height versus altering it did not affect the data throughout the season. So obviously, the easiest and the simplistic for the grower is place it right there at the center at a consistent height that you know you're going to be above the canopy throughout the season, and then you don't have to worry about adjusting it throughout. So about the only issue we have is, as they stated from the very beginning, make sure you're within that 300-foot window, but placing it anywhere along that pivot doesn't matter. And even if that pivot's moving throughout the season, we still didn't have a big change of data. Whether one, if it was watering or moving, it didn't affect the overall data that much. So. No, so the question was, did it matter if the thermocoupler or the sensor was placing towards the pivot or out, and the orientation did not affect it one way or the other either. Yeah, the question is the maintenance behind the sensor itself, and what do we need to be evaluating or looking for throughout the season? Any comments, Avi, first?
Yeah, I would just make sure that like something that we've noticed is that spiders really like it. They really like to wind around it, but oftentimes it's not really, it doesn't even affect the measurements. But I would say that, you know, I've seen this thing like I'm looking at ET sensors right now that are sitting in snow and they're still reporting, you know, and I don't know if you guys have seen the thermocouple. It's this very thin wire, but this thing, for some reason, it can withstand like crazy conditions. And I don't know how it does it, but it's able to withstand it. And even rusts even, and it still works. So I don't, in terms of maintenance, I think that you just have to make sure that it's not been ripped or something like that, or an animal hasn't gotten to it necessarily. But we sell it with a cage around it to protect it so that doesn't happen.
And it's a difficult question because when you look at the filament, it looks like it could get damaged very easily.
Yeah.
But as Avi said, I mean, if it becomes ripped, we're going to know it almost right away in the data. So the data is going to tell us.
Yeah.
But you could go out there visually and think, whoa, that can't be good, the way it looks from the wind or whatever, but it's actually still collecting relevant and valid data.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, exactly.
No, just so quick. Another question back here. Do I cover mine in the winter? And no, I've had left mine out all winter the last couple of seasons. And again, if I go look at the sensor, I really don't want to look at it because it's kind of all twisted, but it's still collecting data.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question from the.
Yeah, so how do you see these working in conjunction with probes, or is it a one or the other type of system?
This is my favorite question, actually. I find that they give very, very much complementary data. And I actually recommend you guys come to the session tomorrow because I'm going to be going into that a lot. And because I did a lot of comparisons between soil moisture sensors and ET sensors, and they don't give exactly the same data, right? Because they're not looking at the same thing, right? One of them is looking at soil moisture. The other one is looking at what your water usage is. But the thing is that if I put these graphs up there and show it to you, you guys will be like, oh my God, they're like moving together completely oftentimes. So it really sort of depends on your specific use case and what you're angling for. And that would be something we would have to go into the weeds with that to really give a good answer. But they give very complementary information, I think.
And I would just hit on that, Avi. I don't know if you mentioned specifically, but when we're looking at this graph up here, I mean, you had a whole stack of these graphs of examples that all the data just aligned and complemented each other very well. So he picked out one just to talk about today, but we had a whole slew of them that all matched up and aligned very
Yeah,
well.
I want to save that for tomorrow, those sort of graphs,
my bad.
because I don't want to overwhelm everybody. And I think we'll go slow and then we can get into the weeds. But I have a bunch of these with soil moisture sensors and I'm very keen on showing y'all. So yeah, you just asked about, can we set about ET, like alert parameters for this? I'm not sure actually. I'm not necessarily in the weeds with that, the software, but do you know, John?
Can answer that when my mic is on. Yeah, so this past season, we did not with the launch. We were just showing you the ability to see the graph and also this thing called ET checkbook, which maybe we should go into, Avi, if you want to. But for this coming year, we will. So there's going to be more features around the graph. We'll also have, yeah, some notification type functionality built on top of it. Yeah, and that's how those Thule customers on the West Coast have been working for 10 years, is they would set a target line either for the absolute value of ET per day or per week, or like a water stress target. So comparing the ET that was measured versus the calculated ET of a well-watered happy crop, and they could set a target line according to that. So those are all functionalities that are coming to CropX through this integration project. Yeah.
This is that graph right here, actually. If you see that, it's kind of like set points, actually, in a way, right? Like,
Yeah.
you'll have like a period of time where you'll want to have a certain amount of stress, and then you'll want to relieve the stress necessarily. So this is something that we plan on, in shipping this as a season.
Avi, you don't have a ET checkbook slide up there, do you?
I don't
Tomorrow?
actually.
Tomorrow?
I could do it tomorrow too. I forgot about that, honestly, but
All right, we're gonna build the anticipation for tomorrow.
okay. I guess that's it. Thanks, guys. Oh, one more. Sweet.
Can we correlate actual ET to satellite imagery from broadacre? This would give us a better idea of ET on large acres without the need for more sensors, allowing us to cover more acres accurately for customers.
You want to correlate, so correlate actual ET with ET derived by satellite, right? That's what you said? Okay. So that's actually sort of what that graph was I showed before, is exactly, instead of just showing though the ET from the satellite, I was showing you sort of like the ET from the satellite normalized to reference ET. So that's sort of the better way of comparing it actually. But yeah, I mean, when you talk about the like to increase it for more acreage, right? We still have to have a sensor in the field to get like an idea. And you could have one sensor for a certain amount of a fetch area for 300 feet, like we said. But when you talk about like for multiple farms, I don't think you could be able to use the thermocouple for more than one pivot, let's say.
Can I add?
Yes, please.
I heard that there have been a couple of remote sensing projects on the academic side that have used ET data from the Thule sensors, like the same setup that we're talking about here, but in the past before CropX came along, for calibration of university models. So they're trying to do ET purely off a satellite with no measurements. Of course, as you know, when you take a stab at that, that's gonna be wrong, right? It's gonna need a calibration. Avi's smiling and nodding because I know he's worked with these algorithms hands-on a ton, as have I. And so it was interesting for me to hear that, those programs will go and build such a model. see that they're off against reality and go hunting around for actual on-ground measurement data for fine-tuning their model. And so they've used our data for that in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I want to say something about those satellite images too. I don't know exactly what satellites they're doing it with, but even if they're doing, satellite imagery that's coming every day, let's say, at the end of the day, it's still a snapshot per day. The data that we're looking at is like down to half hourly data. We're doing a whole budget for the entire day. So it's like we're getting that that temporal resolution that you just won't find anywhere from just plain old satellite imagery data. So the danger of satellite imagery data, and that's what this figure is sort of showing is that you are prone to being blind. You're dependent on that satellite and you are blind while it doesn't give you an image. So there's some sort of there's some risk associated with that.
I think if I could, I think we got a few minutes left of session time before we go on to the next one. I would just be curious to, okay, we got another question. I'll bring it over. I'd just be curious to turn the tables a little bit. I was thinking about this. So ET for corn and soy and all that is such a new application. Nick and team have been innovating with underground data and soil moisture sensors for 20 years now. And we're basically like in year 2 of this. And so we've got a lot of catching up to do in terms of like the type of training that Nick and Rebecca provided this morning. Like we want to get to that point as an organization to where we can do that for y'all for ET2, but we're just, we're earlier. It's earlier, younger technology, earlier in the journey. But I was just curious to ask folks here in the audience, over the past couple of years, have you started to learn a little bit about this new technology coming into play, being available to you? What are some thoughts about scenarios or situations where something like this might be a good fit for agronomic situations that you see? Just curious if any thoughts or hypotheses are on folks' minds, if anybody's willing to share. Yeah, yep. Drought year. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen lots of, and tomorrow again, I keep talking about tomorrow, but I'll show you guys some cases where, you see the soil moisture just sort of drop because it's dry. And you see right away ET drops right, like even before that actually. So it's like one of the first things to respond to stress.
Got a question over here, Avi.
Oh, sorry.
I'm Sam from Sam County Foundation. My question is more about using the sensor for research purposes. I saw in one of the, I think the challenges of a small field. So would you recommend it for something within 1 acre? Because sometimes for research purposes, we don't need that much bigger field, so.
Yeah, I think that like depends on exactly what the crop is, okay? Because it depends on the crop height at the end of the day. And so the idea actually with this whole crop height, the sensor height thing is that, like the higher you go up, the more you're going to get a mixed signal of like sort of the atmosphere around you. And the higher up you go, there's more mixing, right? But if you go down lower, you're actually going to be able to get a better signal. So if you want to get a smaller fetch, because you have a small field, you would just go lower.
Yeah, so like instead of mounting on a pivot way up high where we have that 300-foot radius of measurement, if you've got a smaller crop than corn, you can mount it on a tripod just above the soil surface, and it'll give you you can match your response area to the size of the field pretty well.
Yeah.
I was just saying, we had peanuts. This is in South Alabama.
Cool.
And so we had, I guess like you were saying on a pot, I mean, hip height. That's about how high ours was.
Yeah, yeah. So you wouldn't necessarily need Depending on how large your field is, right, you would make it bigger, you would make it taller or, shorter, depending on that.
And I would just add, just from a technical standpoint, when you're installing an ET sensor, it asks for the height. Don't fudge it.
Yeah.
You want to get that right. It should be in inches
Yeah, I'm
or
watching.
imperial.
I use that actually all the time.
Because it has a huge impact on what that calculation is.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nick. Absolutely.
Question from the Huva.
Here said that they've been using ET from the universities for 10 years or more, and they go to the website to gather ET data and enter it into a spreadsheet and create a graph to keep track of the water used. Is this system similar or more accurate?
I'm sorry, I don't understand that. They're saying that the uni researchers are downloading it as like a CSV and then just putting it on a spreadsheet?
Yeah, I think they're using the data from the university and they're just wondering how this measures up.
Compared to the, I'm just sort of, okay, you already said.
Avi, compared to putting like an ET unit in your field, is that considered more accurate than using the ET data from a university?
Yeah, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, that ET data from the university is very much like a model, and it's not actually measuring what's going on in your field. So this is like actually in your field. This is measuring what's actually occurring in your field. So yeah, for sure.
I can add to that. I'd be curious to know exactly which university data the questioner is asking about, but typically universities provide that data off of weather stations. So what happens is the I don't know, like Oklahoma Messenet, Nebraska, High Plains Regional Climate Center, stuff like that. They've got weather stations owned and maintained by the university around the state that are measuring, wind speed, relative humidity, air temperature, all of that good stuff. And then off of that, they use a model to estimate what the ET around that weather station is. Doesn't take anything into account regarding what the crop is, what the crop stage is. You need crop coefficients for all of that good stuff. So it's something, it's like it's good data about what the atmospheric demand for moisture is, but no, it's not field specific, and it's completely ignorant of what your field's crop is doing today. And so for sure, the measured approach is going to be more accurate. Okay. So, all right. So yeah, Jake's point is take the word maintained by the university with a grain of salt. Oh, okay. Sometimes. Yeah. Was there another question or comment? Yes, sir.
So going back to kind of small fields and stuff like that, we deal with a number of windshield wiper type pivots. Where do you suggest we mount these in that scenario where that center point, say by the road, and it comes to the road and back to the road?
So I think if you just have like if you have a place in your field that there's a prevailing wind, if you have it like a 300 feet, you really could put it in the center, not necessarily the center of the windshield wiper, but more towards the center of the actual field so that it has a canopy around it. And like I said, you could just adjust the height depending on how much area you want.
So question number 2, when we got corn that wipes the truss rods on the pivot, how do we mount it high enough?
Say that again, I couldn't hear you.
When we have corn that's hitting the truss rods of the pivot, how do we mount that sensor high enough and not whack it off every time?
Oh, okay, I understand. So I would just try to put it like necessarily like between them but it can get wet, it can get hit as long as it just doesn't get knocked over and nothing rips the thermocouple, then it should be fine.
And I'll just add to that, you know, there's some situations it's no different than a soil moisture probe. There's probably not a good answer for, and I think that's one of them, whoever asked that. I mean, truss rods or equipment going through the field are going to create some issues. So in a wiper situation, you may be better off pushing towards a soil moisture probe. You know, again, there's not a perfect answer for some of those situations, but we got to keep rolling. So please give Avi a round of applause. I just want to add Avi and team and the Itamars back in Israel. I mean, these are the guys doing all the heavy lifting, a lot of the heavy lifting. I mean, all the data and the science that goes into not only the ET, but the soil moisture monitoring and a lot of the cool and neat stuff that we got coming up relies on this data science team. So thank you.